Good day, chaps. So, today's subject is going to be one of my favourite vehicles, and sadly one that has been given a bad rep over the years, despite being one of the more important vehicles made in the UK. It's the Vickers MBT Mk1, a tank that set a few records and would go on to earn acclaim abroad. There was far too much for one video, and so we'll split this into at least four, with the Vickers Mk1 here, the Vijayanta as part 2, variants of both in part 3, and the Mark III later on. The story begins with the Germans in 1950, when they were still recovering from World War II. The Allies had split the nation into occupied zones, but realised that not only was this stalling Germany's growth as a trading partner, but somewhat seeding resentment with the locals. They also had to contend with the increasingly belligerent Soviet Union just a stone's throw away. With the Iron Curtain up and Soviet tanks amassing at the borders, the Allies felt that the new Federal German Republic should be able to build its own tanks again to act as a buffer zone to the rest of Europe. With notable tank designers like Ferdinand Porsche out of prison and back to building odd vehicles, the Germans set their minds to building a new series of tanks, while using imported American armour in the interim. Around this time, the Indian government approached the Germans with a mind to creating a new tank for them, one which could be built domestically back home. The Indians themselves had gained independence from the British on August 15th, 1947, and the day before, Pakistan had also gained its independence from India, and they lived happily ever after. No. They immediately went for each other, with the first war being declared 2 months later on the 22nd of October 1947. This war involved very few tanks, American M3s, some Churchills and Shermans, but was primarily cavalry and infantry still. Yet both sides were well aware of the current changes in warfare, and set about acquiring new vehicles as fast as possible. The US began to supply Pakistan with tanks such as the M47, while the UK had given India some Centurions. However, while the Centurion was a very good tank, it was also quite expensive, and India had to import all of them, at an added cost. What it desired was its own tank, one it could build in India. However, it also had zero experience in tank building. And so they reached out to the Germans to design them a tank. The Germans drew up several plans and drawings, under the name of Indian Panzer, or Indian tank. The Indians wanted the best gun available at the time, a weight of no more than 40 tons, moderate armour, and good mobility. The Indian Panzer provided this, more or less. It was an average design for the period, a 39.5 ton turreted tank, armed with a 90mm gun and a crew of 4. Quite why they chose Germany is unknown, but it was most likely a political choice. After all, India was not part of NATO, shared borders with communist China, and there was still some resentment there from the British occupation. The Germans had got as far as a series of blueprints for a new tank when the UK was able to sweep in and steal the deal from under Jerry's nose, and they brought the Indians over to the UK trade table, where it offered them a deal that the Indians could not refuse. The British offered to design and build them a tank which could be built under license cheaply and effectively, and to help them they would build an entire tank complex to manufacture the vehicle, as well as schools, local housing, engineering academies, and their own design establishment, which became the DRDO. In exchange, the British would get a big bucket of cash and concessions on tea imports, the latter being worth millions of pounds on its own. So the UK began to rearmour its former colonies, basically for a discount on PG tips. While the UK was happily helping one ally, India, by undermining another, the Germans, they'd also been working on a series of light and medium tanks. The latter design an export proposal under the name Design 45569T had reached the blueprint stage. These were tanks in the 24 to 30 ton range. Both were nearly identical, with one having a 20-pounder gun and the other drawn with a proposed 105mm gun, which Fort Halstead had begun to work on, although at this point it had not taken form. Otherwise they were quite conventional, with 5 road wheels, a 530 horsepower engine, and either the 20-pounder or 105mm gun, with fairly well sloped armour. The vehicle will also be made from all welded steel, with 60mm of armour on the slope, the upper glacis being angled back to about 60 degrees, giving 90mm of effective armour. The turret was made of welded steel, with 80mm of armour over the front. Overall, the vehicle was proof against older 75mm guns as well as 25-pounder high explosive etc., but was not likely to be able to tackle much more in the way of heavier firepower. The most distinctive feature of the vehicle was the inclusion of 8 Vickers Vigilant missiles stored in the turret bustle, with a pop-up launch from the turret roof. This would give the vehicles added firepower at the cost of ammunition capacity, as well as a lucrative revenue for Vickers in the form of parts, maintenance and training for the missiles, as well as the tank itself. This series of vehicles would never be built, however, and although several other plans exist, from anti-aircraft versions to artillery versions, the project was closed down, as there was a new gun on the block, the L7 105mm gun, and everybody wanted it, including India. However, the work done would carry over onto the next design, 46200T. Before this design had even been drawn up, the UK had entered the negotiations with India, and this is where our two timelines meet up. Negotiations commenced in 1959 to develop a tank for use by the Indian Army, which was ratified in 1961. Vickers would design and build the initial batch of tanks for India, as well as building the country's first tank manufacturing plant and support services in Awadhi, Madras, now Chennai, in the Indian state of Tamil Nadu. This new site was officially known as the Heavy Vehicles Factory, or HVF, and under the supervision of the Indian Ordnance Factory Board, who would then take over production and building of the new tank under license. The new Indian factory would go on to become something of a local legend. Many of the surrounding areas were renamed in honour of it, with the renaming of local schools, hospitals and even a police station after the site and the tanks, as well as stamps and currency. The new design was drawn in July 1961 and was in essence a lighter, cheaper and easier to produce Centurion aimed at the export market. It carried over the previous armour values with 60mm on the hull and 80mm on the turret, and was of welded steel plates, easy to manufacture and build for a new tank factory. It was more mobile and agile, weighing in at 39.8 tons to the Centurion's 52 tons. The new machine was outwardly very similar to Centurion, armed with a 105mm gun. They dropped the Vigilant missiles from the bustle and added an extra road wheel for 6 per side. The primary difference lay inside the vehicle, where it used many components from the newer Chieftain tank, including the Leyland L60 engine and the Merritt Wilson TN12 transmission. Exactly why Vickers chose this engine remains unclear. By this point the L60 had not yet begun to show its lackluster performance, and it added a multi-fuel capability. While Vickers may not have known about the engine's significant problems in 1961, it was certainly known by some, as correspondence between the director of Leyland and his own engineers highlighted the latter's grievances. It is possible that Vickers believed the Chieftain would go on to become an export sales success, and thus an economy of scale could be achieved. Not only would parts be cheaper, but those countries might wish to purchase both tanks, and some commonality between the parts might reduce the logistics burden. Alas, Chieftain, while it did have some redeeming features, was never a viable commercial success, and would go on to give the UK many problems over its long career. The first 2 prototypes were built in 1963. One was sent to India for trials, while the second was kept in the UK for refinement. After development and evaluation in the UK, Vickers made a number of modifications and refinements, and 2 designs came out of this. 505-28T, which was the same as the next vehicle, but came with a pair of Swingfire missiles mounted initially on the back of the bustle, aimed at the UK for MOD use, which had customizable options such as infrared driving lights and a spotlight, and the 51025T design, which was the Vickers main battle tank for India, as the UK prohibited the export of Swingfire to them at the time. After some tweaking of the initial export model, Vickers was able to shave off nearly 3 tons of weight, a considerable saving in terms of tank weight. And it's worth noting that while many people think that the most important aspects in a tank design are firepower, mobility and protection, these are actually not as important as the primary factors of weight, dimensions and cost. The new lighter vehicle came in at about 37 tons, leading it to be called appropriately the Vickers 37-ton tank, and later the Vickers Mk1 main battle tank. The new design was very similar in appearance to the previous one, and most changes were internal, and either vehicle side by side would be very difficult to tell apart. The armour remains the same 60mm on the hull and 80mm on the turret. It's worth noting here that people often criticise the Mk1 as lacking armour, but this was 1960s, the age of missiles. in which they are the most effective relative to the armour types available at the time, and anything that could punch through a Vickers Mk1 could, in all likelihood, punch through that of a Centurion anyway. And so, like the German Leopard or the AMX-30, the design priority was on firepower and mobility over protection. The Mk1 has a standard layout that would be immediately familiar to most nations, with a forward right-hand side driver's position, which is typical of countries with a left-hand road system, like the UK or India, while tanks with a left-hand drive often have the driver's position on the other side, such as France and the US. The driver could drive in a full down or in an up position, with his head and shoulders out of the vehicle. The rest of the four-man crew consists of a commander, gunner, and loader, with the first two in the standard position on the right side of the tank, and the loader to the left, to match up with that of Centurion. The power pack remained the Leyland L60 engine, which didn't prove too problematic in the Mk1, as, unlike the Chieftain, the weight was considerably less and placed a lot less stress on the engines. Only much later through lack of parts did it ever become a problem, and the gearbox remained the TN12 system. The Indian Army managed to keep most of their Leyland L60s running for 30 years before they finally packed in, which is pretty impressive, as the UK struggled to keep them running for 30 minutes in the Chieftain on some days. The suspension consisted of 6 pairs of road wheels per side, 3 return rollers with torsion bar suspension, and a top speed of 56 km an hour, about 20 km an hour faster than Centurion. The turret was marginally wider, and unlike the Centurion is made of welded rolled homogeneous plates, which made it fairly unique at the time, with other vehicles being cast or a mix of cast and welded. Cast armour was preferred for a long time due to its ability to be better shaped to increase ballistic protection. However, Vickers chose to go with a welded option, as casting also required large furnaces and dedicated technology, which India did not have at the level required, and thus a vehicle that was to be built out there would need to be easier to build and construct. There were, however, benefits to this. The Mk1 was roomier inside, even compared to Centurion, which is considered quite spacious, by tank standards that is, and this has several important factors. Firstly, it offers more air circulation in hot climates, certainly a must-have in India where the temperatures can average 30 degrees and will peak at over 40 in summer, and any circulation in what is essentially a giant metal box full of smoke and stale farts is always welcome. More importantly, the increase in the room allowed the crew, and especially the loader, room to operate. The work of a manual loader is made considerably easier if he is able to swing his upper body and arms between the ammunition stowage and the breech in one fluid motion, with no obstruction, and this he was able to do in the Vickers Mk1 easily. As a result of this, the Vickers Mk1 set a new record during trials for the fastest time between 2 targets engaged and hit with a 105mm gun, and the fastest rate of fire. The drill included aiming and laying the gun on one target, loading the round, firing, hitting, traversing the gun to another target, laying the gun, firing and hitting it. The time between 2 targets being engaged and destroyed being 5 seconds. A second demonstration of rapid fire to a single target in 1 minute achieved 15 rounds a minute, with 14 hits, giving a reload of just 4.2 seconds. The Vickers main battle tank was also equipped with an all-electric gun control and stabilisation system, of an improved model over that of even Centurion and Chieftain tanks, in the form of the GEC AEI system, which provided full stabilisation, allowing the gun to remain stabilised on a set bearing even when moving at speed, and while nowhere near effective as modern systems, still allowed shooting on the move, which, while taken for granted today, was relatively new then, and the Vickers main battle tank was one of the first to have this advantage. On evaluation, the dispersion was recorded at 0.27 at 1,000 metres, also a record for its time. The whole package would dramatically decrease the time the gunner could lay on target, and get the first shot off, being faster than Centurion, and considerably faster than T55 or T62. Although to have accurate shots at long range, it was still ideally done when stationary. When in stationary mode or for silent watch, the turret could still be traversed by an auxiliary engine, and the weapon system adjusted by hand rotation if required, allowing a very fine lay of the weapon. To assist with aiming, the vehicles also have a rangefinder, in the form of a 12.7mm ranging machine gun, slave to the main 105mm gun. The Vickers main battle tank was able to cross water to a depth of 1.1 metres without preparation, and 2.2 metres with some preparation time. However, should it have to cross deeper stretches of water, it could erect a collapsible flotation screen, in the same manner as the duplex tanks from World War II. This screen was made of reinforced nylon fabric with reinforced bands around it. Before entering the water, the gun was raised to its maximum elevation and faced towards the rear to clear the top of the screen, and other checks ensured. This took about 15 minutes. The vehicle could then enter deep water and swim using its tracks as propulsion. On exiting the water, the screen would then collapse back down quickly to allow the driver to see clearly. Although a similar arrangement had been tested on Centurion, the Vickers main battle tank was the first tank of its size to have the screen as part of its regular inventory, if requested, as opposed to a specialist one. The designed 51025T was put into production as the Vickers Mk1, and work began to build the vehicle for the Indian Army, who would go on to call it the Vijayanta, or Victorious. The first production vehicles were produced at Elswick in Newcastle in 1964, after a visit from the Indian delegation, with the first vehicle having its name on a large brass plaque on the front of the vehicle. These vehicles, 90 in total, were then shipped to India in 1965, and early in 1966 the first English teams from Vickers were sent over to Brodie to begin the development and construction of India's first heavy tank production facility. The same year the first vehicles began to roll off the lines in India, using British-made components shipped over, but these would soon be phased out and nearly all parts would go on to be made in the country itself. But we'll cover more on the Indian version in part 2. Back in the UK, an improved version was designed for clients with a bit more spending power. This vehicle featured battery electrical systems, as well as a pair of Swingfire missiles located at the back, left and right side of the turret bustle. This vehicle sometimes crops up online as the Vickers Mk2, however that's an entirely different project. A further version saw the fitting of an American GM Detroit diesel V12 turbocharged engine, as well as improved optics, thermal sleeve added and so on. This was tested but never found a buyer, however aspects of this would carry over onto the Mark III version. Further sales occurred in the 1970s, with 70 vehicles sold to Kuwait. These were the Mk1 tanks with modifications to the engine's filters for use in desert conditions. It's possible these tanks were called Al Jahara, based on a brass name plaque on one vehicle, and the Al Jahara Kuwaiti task force of the same name, recorded as operating Vickers Mk1s, which was disbanded in 1974. However, until further research can be done, this does remain speculation. These vehicles were then left in the desert, although later on at least one was converted into a tug for towing a chieftain vehicle around, while others were used as HESH targets. It remains unclear if these vehicles are still there today or have entirely been scrapped now. Several notable versions were built on the Mk1 hull for export. These included the Marksman anti-aircraft system and the VSEL GBT 155 mm gun turret, as well as an armoured recovery version and bridge layer. So why is this vehicle an important one, and why is it missing from the UK or none remain here? Well, this is a difficult question. Certainly the money received by Vickers was very important. Records show that post-war their land side was in the red, and a cash injection from such a large export was very welcome. It kept Vickers in the bank's good books and helped keep them going for another 30 years. The second is a lack of knowledge or interest back home, as the vehicle did not serve in the UK and thus did not get the plethora of books or materials written about it that Centurion and Chieftain did, and so it slipped from the public's overall memories. And although offers for one to come to the UK were raised a few years ago, the idea gained little traction with the museum here. The Mk1 was and remains an important vehicle. It was a good tank. It broke many world records and saw service in some of the largest tank battles of the 20th century, where it proved itself admirably, with many medals and awards given to its crews for bravery. The Mk1 is and remains, in my opinion, one of the most important British and Commonwealth tanks. Well guys, this video is getting a bit long, so we'll cut it here. Part 2 will cover the Vijayanta in India, and its variants, of which there are many interesting vehicles. And we'll also look at the enigmatic Mark II vehicle, and other projects done by Vickers at the same time, such as the VAPT. And then later we'll cover things like the Vickers Mark III and IV and so on. If you did like this, do give us a like and subscribe and all that gubbins. And until next time, Toodle pip.